All right, folks. We'll get started here in just everybody hear me all right? I was a little bit rushed on, so I was finalizing and recording another video from another lecture, and it just turned off, so just wanting my make sure everything's going good. Before we jump into emotion stuff, just wanted to go through and again, just make sure that everybody's clear on kind of where we're at. So we're past the midway of the semester. We've got 2 more quizzes left. We've got quiz 6 and quiz 7. Quiz 7, this is the last one. This is the stuff that we'll be doing on clinical psychology. That's the one that's going to be, that's mandatory. Okay. So if you don't take quiz 7, you're going to get a goose egg on your average. That's going to pull things way down. You don't want that. Okay. So again, as I said before, if you've been really strong on these quizzes, or you've just been happy with your quizzes up to this point, it would make sense if this last quiz wasn't mandatory to just sort of hang out and just not have to worry about things for the end of the semester. But I like you all way too much. I want you to be here for the end of the semester, so making that last quiz mandatory. But if you're in a good spot and need to devote resources towards something else for this last unit, that makes sense to me in terms of stuff. So again, probably right now, if you're up on your research, you're probably doing a lot better than you think you are based on sort of quiz scores here. And in that posting that I had put up, we have your required quiz average for different grade points, right? And so this is just 2 scenarios. If you just get 6 hours, let's say you got 6 hours, but you had an unexcused no-show, you'd be in this column. If you max out all your extra credit, 9 hours with no unexcused no-shows, you're here. If you're somewhere in between, you'll be somewhere in between. But just to kind of give you a sense for where you're at with stuff. Okay. Any questions on any of this? People feeling generally good about this? Okay, cool. If you have questions, let me know. I'll help you out. But this should, give you a good sense for kind of where you're at with stuff. So, all right. Today, going to switch over into I don't know. This is cool stuff. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm not a social psychologist, but as an undergrad, flirted around with social psychology. It's a cool area. Going to start things off by talking about some affective science stuff and talking about emotion. Okay. So if we're talking about what is emotion, like most things in psychology, you say, what is emotion? People look like you're dumb or something. They go, what do you mean, what's emotion? Well, everybody knows what emotion is, right? But it turns out that if I'm going to study emotion and actually try and pin down a definition, this starts to become very, very difficult, okay? And as we start to go through and throw out definitions, it starts to become pretty easy to poke holes in them, okay? So for an example, operational definition of emotion, emotion being a conscious mental reaction experienced as a strong feeling, usually directed towards a specific object, typically accompanied by physiological and behavioral changes in the body. Okay, seems pretty good, right? Seems pretty inclusive, sounds official. Why might we take exception to this definition of emotion?
The fact that it's conscious.
Yeah. Olivia, was that you? Yeah. The fact that it's conscious. Why, Olivia, help me out. Why might consciousness sort of be problematic if we're thinking about emotion?
Well, I know sometimes I have an emotional response and I don't really know why I'm having it. I mean, I don't see a spider and consciously think I'm afraid.
Yeah. Sometimes, right? And we've got strong evidence for this, that we can start to have reactions that kind of fall outside of our awareness, right? It doesn't have to be like, and think about this. People are like, oh, hey, how you feeling today? I'm feeling like garbage. Why? I don't know. I've just got low mood. I'm feeling kind of sad and down. I can't tell you why. And it's hard, right? You think that a conscious mental reaction would be, oh, hey, I'm having a reaction to X, Y, and Z. Probably if we dug a little bit deeper, there's some stuff in there. But this idea of consciousness starts to become kind of problematic, perhaps. So, all right, what about this? A mental state that arises spontaneously rather than through conscious effort, accompanied by physiological changes. Seems reasonable, but why might we start to poke holes in this?
Some emotions build.
What's that, Jonathan?
Some emotions build.
Some emotions build. What do you mean by that?
It takes a while for them to fully.
Okay, so you're just kind of building up emotion, right? And sort of putting it together, right? Has anybody ever actively thrown themselves into an emotional state? Like, tried? Yeah. Can we do that? Absolutely, right? Think about anybody who's ever, maybe you played sports in high school or something like that. You're getting jazzed up, right? You're getting pumped up. That's not spontaneous. You're actively doing that, right? Or maybe I go through and I'm just kind of in a sad mood and I throw on some emo downer music, right? And just sort of get myself worked into a state. So emotion can be spontaneous, but it doesn't have to be, right? So we can consciously sort of work ourselves into states. And sometimes these emotions might not be accompanied by physiological changes. So maybe we don't like this. What about this? A response of the whole organism involving physiological arousal, expressive behavior, and conscious experience. Why don't we like this? Why might I take exception to this definition here?
You might not experience all three.
Yeah, exactly. I might, and boy, Lord help us if all of our emotions all the time were expressed by a congruent expressive behavior, right? We probably wouldn't be terribly successful in interpersonal interactions if I've got my heart on my sleeve and every time I feel something, I express that. That's going to go poorly for me in a lot of ways, right? So maybe we don't experience all of these. Maybe that we already tag the conscious experience stuff. So there's some problems here. Feelings that involve subjective evaluation, physiological processes, and cognitive beliefs, right? Same type of thing. Maybe I don't have a physiological reaction. Maybe I don't have a cognitive belief about something. Maybe I'm just feeling something and I can't tell you why. I'm not sure whether there's a cognition in there, right? You got a complex pattern of changes, including physiological arousal, feelings, cognitive processes, behavior, or actions made in response to a situation perceived to be personally significant. So we got this personally significant piece that we've added in on this definition. Why might we take exception to that? Anybody ever have emotional reaction to something that has nothing to do with them? Yeah. Okay. So again, if we're going through and trying to sort of say, all right, this is the universal definition of emotion, this is a hard thing to do, right? And as we go through and start to look at different theories or models of emotion, different theories have gone through and they sort of put different emphases on different pieces and parts. And so what we want to do is go through and evaluate these and say, okay, sort of how can we best understand emotion and sort of how it all puts together and works, right? So we've talked about a lot of things that we don't agree on, but some things that we do agree on, right? In general, people are generally on board with the idea that emotional reactions involve three sort of loosely related components, okay? We've got the subjective response, right? This is your internal experience of some type of emotional experience. We've got a physiological response, changes in your body that are going on when we go through and experience some of these emotional reactions, and some sort of behavioral response, right? This could be expression. This could be moving forward towards things that make us excited, moving away from things that make us fearful. And generally, people will agree that emotion, sort of however we decide to put it together, whatever theory we're working with, generally involves some combination of these elements, okay? And we also agree that emotions are generally thought to be adaptive, okay? Now, sometimes, sort of our emotions can get away from us and they influence us to do things that are maybe not helpful. But in general, right, if we think about a world without emotion, right, what would that look like? We probably wouldn't be super good social creatures, right? We know that emotion helps us organize and direct behavior. So as we get closer and closer to an exam for this class, what types of emotions do you all feel?
Stress.
Some stress, okay.
Anxiety,
right? And Jonathan, what does that stress and anxiety motivate you to do?
Generally, I try and find some time to actually study for it.
Okay, right? So it starts to organize your response. I'm feeling anxious about this. I have something on the horizon. And so I'm going to organize. And so it's going to motivate me to engage in adaptive behavior. What about, let's say, you have been, someone's done you wrong, right? Something happened where someone's taken advantage of you. Something's gone. How do you feel about that? Feel angry, right? And if I'm angry, what does that do? Sometimes it makes us feel powerful, right? It motivates us to go through and do and resolve a situation, right? As opposed to just sort of taking stuff from folks all the time, right? And so we can see emotion being important for organized behavior, facilitating decision making. This is kind of this gut decision, right? If I'm going through and making all my decisions with a cold algorithm or response, it's going to take too long, right? Sort of this idea like I can feel a certain way and it triggers me to start to make decisions, sometimes that aren't right, but sometimes are, right? Huge, starting to communicate sort of what I've got going inside to both myself and somebody else. If I'm feeling sad, right, it means that, hey, man, there's something out of whack in my life or my situation. It alerts me to sort of what's going on. Also, right, think about how if you go up to a friend or a family member or just anybody on the street, we get a lot of information just looking at their expression, their body language, and things like that, right? If this person's agitated and angry, maybe not a good time to go up and ask them for a favor or something like that, right? It helps us communicate with one another and know how to respond appropriately. Also strengthening interpersonal relationships, all right? Think about if you have a partner or any type of romantic relationship or something like that, and let's say that person shows no emotion ever. Would that be a successful relationship? No, that's kind of that would be hard to maintain that, right? And so when we think about emotion, we agree that, yeah, it's probably got sort of involved a subjective component, a physiological component, and behavioral component. Agree there. And generally, I believe that emotions are adaptive, right? From an evolutionary psychology standpoint, we would say that we've developed the capacity for complex emotion because it's helped us survive as a species. It does a lot of good things for us, right? But outside of that, different models of emotion start to get very different viewpoints on how these experiences are generated, what comes before what, and sort of some of the limitations of experience, expression, and stuff like that. Questions to this point on any of the stuff we're talking about here? Okay, cool. So first theory we're going to talk about here is James Lange. Okay. With the James Lange theory, okay, the main idea here with James Lange is that your physiological response is going to be the primary component of basic emotion experience. Okay. With James Lange, says emotion that I'm going to go through and I'm going to encounter emotional stimulus out in the universe, right? And that emotional stimulus that I encounter is going to generate some automatic physiological response. I'm going to have a bodily reaction. My physiology is heart rate's going to increase, things along those lines. I might start shaking, sweating. Stuff's going to happen inside. And what happens is my body then interprets that physiological state as some sort of subjective emotion. Okay, so walking through the woods, see a bear. See the bear. Bear produces physiological response. Body explodes. Heart rate increases. I start to shake. My respiration increases. And then what happens is my body takes this specific pattern of physiological changes and interprets it as an emotion. Okay. So with the James Lange model, what we've got is a stimuli which creates an emotional reaction, or excuse me, a physiological reaction that my body then interprets as an emotion. And depending on that specific profile of physiological changes, my body interprets that as different types of subjective emotion. Okay. Now, thoughts on this? Is this a little bit different than how we might normally think about emotional reactions? If I had to ask you how emotion worked, is this what you would come up with? Jonathan, you said I saw you shaking your head. No, why not? What's weird about this?
Oh, for me, it's too specific or broad, even.
Okay.
Doesn't account for much.
Okay. So yeah, sort of some not adding, sort of getting into some of the complexity of stuff. What about the order of this stuff? Does this order seem strange to people? Yeah. I don't know. When I see I see something, and then I'm like, oh wow, that's a thing, and have an emotion, and then experience a physiological response. Right? James Lang says it's the opposite. For James Lang, talking about a quote from James saying that emotion stripped of physical manifestation, no longer emotion, but a cold, neutral state of intellectual perception. Okay. So for the James Lang model, if I go through and I cross out this physiological piece, can I experience an emotion? No. I can say I should feel this way in this situation, but it's not giving me an authentic emotional experience if I cut this physiological response out of the way. Okay. Now, James Lang sort of proposed this as being specific to our basic emotions. So, Jonathan, when you're saying it's kind of oversimplistic, that's kind of what James Lang was getting into. They say this is for our core basic emotions: fear, happiness, fear, joy, anger. This small set of core emotional reactions. That's kind of what this is kind of targeting. But really, really groundbreaking, because what James Lang is saying is that physiological response is primary. Okay. And what our body does, even though it seems like, oh, I just know that I'm happy when I'm happy, or I'm sad when I'm sad, James Lang is saying, nope, what's happening is I'm encountering something. My body is having a physiological change, and what my body does is it interprets that specific pattern of physiological change as some category of emotion. People understand the gist of what James Lang is saying here? Okay. So, super influential theory, and super kind of groundbreaking in that it's playing around with sort of the ordering of these elements, right? But lots of criticisms against James Lang. People will say that physiological response is too slow to account for our emotional experiences. Anybody done any work or research or worked in a lab where they're measuring psychophys or physiological types of responses? If you've done this type of work before, what you know is that for a lot of our different physiological reactions, there's a little bit of a delay, right? Like I don't see things and immediately adrenaline's dumped into my system, or immediately my skin conductance changes and things like that. We got a little bit of a lag, right? But I can see something and be immediately afraid, or instantly angry, or instantly excited, joyful, right? And so people will say, this is too slow, right? If I have to wait for a physiological reaction to occur and my body to interpret it, that would mean I'd have sort of this, I should see these types of delays in my emotional experience. Okay. People criticize this for not being physiological response, for not being distinct enough to start to differentiate emotion. And this is probably a pretty big criticism of James Lang. Okay. When we go through and we take a look at this, if, Natalie, I see you on the screen there, if you were to come into the lab and I were to sort of provide some sort of stimuli or something like that that would make you very happy, right? I'd be like, hey, guess what? You won $100, right? You'd be pumped about that, right? Probably. If I were to monitor your physiological reaction, I would probably see increased heart rate, increased respiration, things like that, right? But then if I went through and I'm like, hey, you failed this class, this was all a joke, you lose, right? You'd maybe be angry, and we'd still see increase in physiological response, increase in heart rate, increase in respiration, right? And so the concern is, and we've done a lot of research with this, it's very hard to find specific profiles of physiological responding that are specific to an emotion, right? What we generally see is an increase in activation or decrease in activation, and there's some evidence for that. If I look at you physiologically, sadness looks maybe a little bit different than anger, but it's a really, really hard to sort of actually, if I had you hooked up to equipment and I was just reading your physiological responses, it would be very, very difficult for me to accurately say what you were actually feeling. Because and people will say that there's just not enough there's not just enough differentiation in the pattern of physiological respondings to make this viable. Now, we do see some emotion-specific kind of characteristics, but it's a reasonable criticism, okay? Other thing, too, is people will say physiological response isn't necessary for emotional experience, right? The argument being that if I do cut out this physiological responding, people do continue to have emotions, right? Which, again, is fair. Within James Lang, this physiological piece is kind of primary. And if we're doing a strict interpretation, if I don't have this physiological piece, I can't have a subjective emotion, right? But in looking at some research, and people have looked at affective responding in folks who are quadriplegic, so they have spinal cord damage, so that I don't feel or have a feeling of sort of my body, right? What we see in individuals who, if I can't feel my body, I don't know if my heart rate's increasing or if I'm sort of things are going on, right? Seeing among those individuals that sort of will report maybe lower levels of emotional intensity, right? So maybe some evidence for this physiological piece sort of helping to drive the intensity of emotion. But, we would not say that individuals with spinal cord injuries don't experience emotion, right? So some questions there, right? Questions about James Lang? All right. So as we're working through these models, what you'll find is that they're all using the same kind of pieces and parts. We're just kind of putting them in different orders. So as you're working through these and trying to keep these straight in your head, pay attention to the order. What leads to what leads to what? This will help you keep these theories kind of straight in your mind. Okay. All right. So James Lang comes out. James Lang, hugely influential. People are excited about James Lang, but then people start to get upset or sort of criticize James Lang back. Okay, we need a different theory. So then we got Cannon-Bard. Okay, and Cannon-Bard theory generated out of some experimental work with cats. Okay, and so in the lab, what they had done was taken these cats and severed the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so these cats were unable to. So I have no sympathetic response, right? There's no sympathetic reaction in these animals. But when they went through and presented these animals or these cats with sort of different type of stimuli, still see species-specific reactions that sort of look like emotional reactions. So if I present sort of videos in front of or sort of present the cat with a dog or something like that, still see hissing and spitting and things along these lines, hair standing up, suggesting that even though these cats don't have, we essentially, what we did is we cut out this physiological piece of things, still demonstrating a reaction, okay? And so what Cannon-Bard said is, okay, what we need to do is we need to revise this theory. And so Cannon-Bard said that what we do is we get emotional stimuli out in the world. What that emotional stimuli does is it simultaneously produces independent physiological and subjective responses, okay? So we've got different pathways that when I encounter something that has some sort of emotional valence, I'm getting a physiological response, a subjective response, but these things are working through different pathways. And what happens then is I experience these physiological and subjective responses together And this is what I experience as emotion. Okay. So from Cannon Bard, we got our stimuli. Bear in the woods. Bear in the woods, separately through independent pathways, creates a physiological reaction and a subjective reaction, right? And then what happens is I experience this physiological reaction and subjective response together as an emotional experience. Okay. So again, what Ken and Bard were talking about here is I can go through and I can sever this pathway, right? I can cut out the physiological response piece of things. But what I've got is I still have this independent pathway that's leading the subjective experience. And so I still have that emotion. I'm not getting this piece of it, but this is running through an independent pathway. So I'm still getting this. And what happens in sort of day-to-day life for most of us, sort of in our daily encounters, we experience this subjective component and this physiological component just kind of at the same time. And we're like, okay, that's an emotion. So people see the difference here, what Cannon Bard is doing. Okay? So Cannon Bard is saying that this autonomic feedback isn't necessary. Okay. Unlike James Lang, I don't need this physiological response to then produce my subjective experience. Cannon Bard is saying the subjective experience is happening on its own through separate pathways. Physiological response is coming through its own stuff. I can cut this and still get that physiological response, which is a nice way to go through and account for why we're seeing sort of the animal equivalent of emotion, even though we've gone through and cut that physiological response. Okay. And again, as opposed to James Lang, where James Lang, kind of the central component of James Lang is that I see things in the universe and then I have a physiological reaction, and that specific configuration of physiological changes, the way my heart rate changes and my breathing in changes and my sort of adrenaline changes and my skin conductance changes, like all that specific profile is like a key to then experience an emotion. Cannon Bard just says, I don't know, things go up and down. We have general autonomic physiological activation with strong emotion that increases, and then this is kind of what ends up happening. So this is what kind of maybe drives some of the intensity of emotion. Okay, and again, this starts to help us account for if I'm looking at your physiological reactions to a fight reaction and a flight reaction, those look very, very similar. Okay. Now, that's not to say that we just haven't developed sufficient ways to go through and tease this out, but it's a lot easier to account for with this theory than Cannon Bard than James Lang. Okay. Questions on Cannon Bard? All right. But criticisms of Cannon Bard. Cannon Bard is saying that this subjective component and this physiological component are happening separately through different pathways, right? I can sever one, the other one's operating on its own. But in actual fact, we find that the subjective component and the physiological component tend to be tied together, at least to some extent, right? And if these are operating through completely different pathways, it suggests that this thing and this thing should be completely independent if they're working through completely separate mechanisms, right? But that's not what we see. We generally see that the physiological response is associated to some extent with the subjective response, and so Cannon Bard doesn't do a real good job of teasing this apart. Okay. Other thing that we might criticize Cannon Bard for, and James Lang as well, is that neither one of these theories specify the role of any type of cognitive process. Okay, we've gone through with both of these theories and not even considered, Jacob, if you see a bear in the woods, how you feel about that, or what's going on, and what's going on in your head, right? And if we think about day-to-day emotions, there's a lot of stuff going on up here, right? Neither one of these theories take in any cognitive appraisals into account, and so argument is that these are somewhat incomplete. All right, so this gets us to Schachter and Singer, two-factor theory. Schachter and Singer theory, in every single textbook, so there's some problems with it, but it's an interesting theory and an interesting kind of story about sort of how they claimed evidence for this. But what Schachter and Singer are saying is like, okay, what we're saying is that physiological response. Okay, the Schachter and Singer are saying, all right, we kind of agree with James Lang that physiological response is important. Right, physiological response is really kind of the heart of our emotional experience, but not because we get specific patterns of emotional reactions or specific patterns of physiological responses. What Schachter and Singer are saying is that what happens, we go through and we see emotional stimuli in the universe, right? And this emotional stimuli produces a physiological response. But then what Schachter and Singer said is what we do is we then look around our environment to kind of see what's going on and use that cognitive label and sort of use sort of information for our environment to attach a cognitive label to that physiological reaction, which then turns into emotion. Okay, so for Schachter and Singer, I see a bear. I have physiological explosion. Okay, so we're still on James Lang trajectory right here. But then what Schachter and Singer said is what I do is I sort of look around my environment and be like, oh, hey, what's going on with this? Oh, hey, there's a bear. And that bear then, like, oh, hey, that's a bear. That's why I'm having this physiological reaction. And then that's what leads to the subjective emotion. Okay? So Schachter and Singer, basically we're just taking James Lang and we're dropping this cognitive label in there, right? So Schachter and Singer they're not saying that there's some unique pattern of physiological responding that my body then interprets as fear in this situation. What happens is I have a physiological explosion. I look around and say, hey, what the hell's going on? There's a bear. Now I'm afraid. People kind of see the difference with this. Okay, so with Schachter and Singer, classic experiment. You'll find this in all any general psych textbook, and it's interesting and pretty cool. So what Schachter and Singer came up with this model. They're like, okay, how do we test it, right? So what Schachter and Singer did is they brought group of people in, say, okay, hey, come visit, and this was done in, I think the 50s or 60s. So if you're asking yourself as I'm describing this, hey, how did they do that? It was the 50s and 60s. So brought people in, and everybody who came into the study, they went through and they injected with epinephrine. Okay, what's epinephrine?
Adrenaline.
Yeah, it's adrenaline, okay? And so what they did, they brought people in and they're like, hey, I'm just going to give you this injection of stuff. And so for one group, randomized people into two groups. For one group, they said, hey, I'm going to inject you with adrenaline. It's going to make you feel, it's going to give you increased heart rate, sweating, sort of some general agitation, because I've just pumped you up with adrenaline, right? Sort of basically biologically instigating this fight or flight reaction. Okay. Other group, they said nothing to. they didn't give an explanation for what was going on, right? Now I don't know. Do you come at me? You're gonna inject me with something. I'm like, hey, what's that? Like, don't worry about it. It's fine. I don't know exactly how that may manage to pull that off. This certainly wouldn't pass muster for ethical review now. But two groups injected everybody with adrenaline. One group they told, hey, this is what it's going to do. Other group, they said, sort of, don't worry about it. Okay. After they gave people an injection, put them in a room, and there's a Confederate in this room. So kind of think about the same thing as Bandura's Bobo doll experiment. One group, so some people in both groups either had a Confederate in there that was sort of euphoric and happy and sort of laughing and sort of, I guess, throwing paper planes or something like that, which seems like a weird way to express your happiness, but sort of doing stuff like that. Other group of people went in, and the Confederate in there was sort of aggravated, angry, sort of stomping around, sort of things like that. Okay. And so what they did then is had these people sit in with the Confederate for a while, and then went through and asked the people who they had shot up with adrenaline how they felt, okay, in terms of emotion. And so based on Schachter and Singer, based on this model, for the people who were in the room with the happy Confederate or the joyful Confederate, who would Schachter and Singer expect to experience greater levels of sort of positive emotion? The folks who they had told what the injection was going to do, or the people who they didn't tell what the injection was going to do?
People they told.
Okay, and why do you say that, Jonathan?
Because you're already setting them up for it.
Okay, but that's sort of good thinking. But if you go through and you inject me with a bunch of adrenaline, and you say, "Hey, this is what adrenaline's going to do to you," and then I start to feel that, right? Do I need to find an explanation for why my body's all sort of getting cranked up and out of control? No, I know it, right? Because you said, "Hey, I'm going to shoot you up with adrenaline," right? But what if you shoot me up with adrenaline, you don't tell me what it's going to do? Then do I have an explanation?
That's kind of open-ended at that point.
Yeah, right? Exactly. You're exactly right. It's kind of open-ended. And that's where Schachter and Singer, and so that's what they claimed, is that for those individuals with the happy Confederate, reporting that individuals who they didn't tell, the uninformed people, reported higher levels of happiness and positive emotion than the group of people who they told, "Hey, this is what it's going to do," right? And the idea being that for those individuals who got shot up with adrenaline, we're kind of skipping the stimulus, we sort of artificially just increased the physiological response. The idea being that those people who didn't know what the effects of that injection were going to be were having a physiological experience, looked around the room to say, "Oh, hey, what's," sort of trying to take some cues in to figure out why I'm feeling this way. I see someone who's excited and happy and sort of going things around. And so what I then do, in theory, is interpret my increase in physiological reaction as consistent with happiness, right? Same thing for the people who were placed in the room with the angry Confederate, okay? I'm in a room with an angry Confederate. I don't know why my body's going nuts, but I see this guy and sort of contextual cues, like, yeah, I'm kind of angry too, right? And so reporting higher levels of anger, negative emotion than the people who they had told. Because if you tell me, then I don't need this label. I already know why my physiological response is going through the roof, is because you shot me full of adrenaline, right? And so this was the way that Schachter and Singer went through and experimentally tried to test this chain of events. Okay? Do people kind of see sort of how this experiment is intended to map on and test this theory? So again, the idea is similar to James Lange, right? The idea is that I go through the universe, I see stuff, and some of that stuff is emotionally valence. It creates a physiological reaction. So physiology is still primary, but instead of my body interpreting a specific pattern of physiological activation, what I do is I experience this, I look around in my environment, get cues, and then use those cues to determine sort of what I'm actually feeling. So a really, really interesting theory, but a lot of problems with this theory, okay? One of the primary issues is problems with methodology in Schachter and Singer's study, right? Like, I don't know, like recognizing that we didn't have the ethical controls of that we do today back when they were doing this, but still giving someone an injection is something, then tell them not to worry about it. Like, I don't sort of, I mean, people weren't dummies, right? And so some questions about sort of the extent to which this study actually maps on and provides a good test. Also some pretty serious concerns duplicating or replicating the effects in this study, okay? So again, experimenters weren't blinded to conditions, so the experimenters knew who received what. There's a lot of stuff that was I mean, it's a cool study, and it ends up being in all the textbooks, but the extent to which they actually captured a true replicable effect is questionable. Other thing, too, is that Schachter and Singer say, okay, here's the model. This is the way emotion works, right? But what they said, well, okay, well, so we got this environmental stimuli, which triggers a physiological reaction, which I then look around in my environment and then make the emotional, then that tells me what emotion I'm experiencing, right? But they said, but also cognition could trigger emotion independently of physiological reaction. So basically what they're saying is, yeah, this is how emotion works, except when it doesn't. And then sometimes I can just have a cognitive reaction that then triggers a physiological response. Right? And so we start to have problems with your theory needs to account for things well. Your theory can't be like, oh yeah, it happens this way, except when it doesn't, then it happens a completely different way. So some problems with sort of their response to some of the criticisms of this. So of the theories that we've talked about or will talk about in sort of all of this whole lecture, Schachter and Singer is probably the one that isn't actually the least amount of evidence. I mean, it's the one that's one of the most prominent in our textbooks from a historical standpoint, but probably not a great theory. In terms of evidence, I mean, sort of kind of a cool theory, but not evidence to support it so much. Questions on Schachter and Singer?
Dr. Clapp?
Yeah.
That last criticism proposed that cognition may trigger emotion independent of physiological response.
Uh-huh.
Is that only a criticism because of the evidence available?
No. This is a criticism because basically what they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, right? Essentially saying, yeah, no, physiological response, similar to James Lang, physiological response is central. Like physiological response is at the core of emotional experience. And so again, if I'm looking at this stream of events, if this is how things work, if I cut out this physiological response, can I experience emotion? Nope, I can't, right? But as we're going to talk about in the next theory, so these appraisal theories started to come up, and Schachter and Singer said, oh, well, yeah, that can happen too. I can just have some sort of thought and that can trigger an emotion outside of a physiological experience. But that's a completely different framework than what you've proposed, right? You can't have it both ways. Okay. Does that help? Okay. Other questions on Schachter and Singer? All right. So this brings us to our appraisal theories. Okay. Appraisal theory. This is one of our. This is a big sort of. We got a couple. This is one of the big camps. You know, folks. Lazarus is one of the main people here. A proponent of developer of appraisal theory. Appraisal theory says that cognition, sort of what's going on up here, essential for emotion, right? Some of the James Lang, Schachter, and Singer say physiological reactions are central to emotion. I can't have an emotion if I don't have this physiological change. Lazarus flips this around and says, nope, it's cognition. Cognition is what's the key to emotional experience, right? And so what our appraisal theories are arguing is that what happens, we go around life and we see things that may have some sort of emotional valence to them. And what happens is we develop some sort of response, cognitive appraisal as a reaction to, in response to these experiences. And what appraisal theories said that it's this appraisal that then results in our subjective experience and our physiological response. Okay, so from appraisal theory, I'm walking around, I see a bear. Have an appraisal, have some sort of thought or assessment of the situation, and depending on how I assess that situation, that's what gives rise to our subjective emotion and our physiological response. Okay. Now, this probably maps on much more cleanly into sort of our own intuitive experience of emotion, right? I see something, I make an interpretation of that thing, and then I have some sort of emotional experience, right? And what's from an appraisal theory standpoint, this appraisal, as sort of proposed by Lazarus, kind of dependent on two different things, right? The appraisal is based on, is this relevant to me, and can I cope with the consequences? Okay, and based on the answers to that question, those questions, this is then what gives rise to different emotional experiences. Okay, and what's cool about this is this model starts to do a really nice job of accounting for why different people have very different emotional reactions to the same type of sort of situation, right? So I'm an egghead professor at the university, right? If I'm walking through the woods, I see a bear. I ask myself, is this relevant to me? Yep. Can I deal with this situation? Nope. And so I'm going to have an intense emotional reaction to this, probably fear, terror, things like that, right? Now, my younger brother is a biologist for the state, works with large carnivores. He traps bears and mountain lions and stuff like that for a living. My brother, walking through the woods, sees a bear, could have a very different appraisal than I would have, and end up maybe with a different type of emotional reaction. Okay. Now this is kind of an extreme reaction, but think about if you, either yourself or somebody that you know, gets really anxious in social situations. Okay. Other people, very, very comfortable in social situations, right? So if we put two different people in the same situation, let's say, so the situation is going up and starting a conversation with, say, someone at the bookstore, sort of person behind the counter that you don't know, right? Some people are going to find that incredibly anxiety-provoking. Other people are going to be fine with it, no big deal, right? Appraisal theory says the difference there is we have some emotional stimuli, right? Encountering or approaching someone who we don't know. Depending on what my appraisal of that situation is, if I don't have social anxiety, I might be like, okay, I'll just talk with this person, no big deal. Maybe I'm excited to meet someone new, and so I get some sort of like happiness, anticipation, excitement here. Or maybe I don't think much of anything about it, so I don't get too much of a reaction, right? But if I have social anxiety, right, if you're someone who worries about this, right, sort of the thought may be, this person is going to think badly about me, this person is going to think I'm dumb or stupid, I'm going to say something wrong. This person is I'm going to embarrass myself. Now, all of a sudden, same situation, very different appraisal, very different subjective response with this, okay? And so what appraisal theories are saying is that this cognition, this appraisal of the situation is the thing that drives emotion. From a strict appraisal standpoint, we're saying that if we don't have an appraisal of a situation, we can't have a subjective reaction. Does this make sense? Okay. This is a great theory. Really, really strong theory, and is the basis for a lot of sort of the cognitive therapy that we do, right? When we're working with people who are struggling with anxiety and depression, a lot of times it's because of the way we're looking at situations versus sort of something that's inherently sort of qualitatively sort of stable about that situation, right? So working with some of these cognitions, some of these appraisals, see how people are thinking about things, right? But criticisms of this appraisal theory is when we're looking at emotion, we know that emotion can be instantaneous and sometimes unavoidable, right? I can't sometimes not feel a certain way, right? And when I feel things, sometimes it's immediate, right? The idea here is if I encounter everything in daily life and I have to say, oh, is this relevant to me? Can I deal with it? That's taken some time there to go through and evaluate that situation. The argument against appraisal theories is like this emotion could be instantaneous, right? And if there's a whole bunch of thinking going on, we would think that there was maybe a delay there, right? We also know that emotional responses can be hard to verbalize, right? If I ask you how you're feeling to something, even if you know, right, like you're sort of encountered, you're socially anxious, you're in a situation like, oh, hey, why are you anxious, right? It can be hard to put words to what I'm feeling inside. This whole appraisal process is very verbal in nature, right? It's saying that, oh, I'm sort of in words thinking about what the situation is, how it impacts me, whether or not I can cope with it. Doesn't really it's not really fitting with this difficulty that we can have expressing and talking about the types of emotional things that we're feeling, right? And then finally, we have some pretty good evidence that emotion may occur without some sort of explicit cognition. Okay, if we think about emotion in babies, small kids, right, infants. If I've got an infant who's crying, it would be hard to argue that that's not an emotion, right? But am I to believe that this infant at sort of 2 weeks old saw something, assessed the situation, thought about whether or not it was relevant to them, whether or not they could handle that situation, and then selected a response based from that? Probably not, right? And so some limitations, right? And again, from a strict appraisal theory is saying, like, we have to have this appraisal of a situation in order to experience an emotion, which probably is the way things happen a lot of the time. But there are situations where it's hard to justify or hard to make an argument for there was some sort of explicit evaluation of a situation that then led to an emotion. And so again, is maybe capturing something or sort of identifying a subset of situations that appraisal theory has a hard time accounting for. Okay. So appraisal theory is really good. A lot of cool stuff going on here, but not sort of perfect like any other theory, having some limitations there. Right. So we've got one more theory, Zient's emotional cognitive independence model, which we'll finish this up, but we'll pick that up on Monday. But that takes us to time. Any questions about material that we've got here? Anything we need to cover? Anything along those lines? We good? All right, cool. Well, thanks, folks. I know the Friday after after an exam is attendance dips, but thanks for hanging in there. Let me know if you're running into any questions. Let me know if you want to go through, talk about your grade at all. Happy to go through and we can catch up and meet on that. Make sure to go through and jump into modules early, get a head start on taking notes and working through this stuff. Otherwise, stay safe, and we'll catch you on Monday. All right? See ya.